together. So that's.
I always remember talking when I was real small that 512, 5, 5, 12
is the way that our books today, are put together in an order like that. All right. So the first, nothing we can do about it. It's been doing that for weeks now.
What is it?
No idea. Haven't been able to figure it out yet. Yeah, it started about 3 weeks ago. 4 weeks ago.
What is it? The noise?
No idea. I haven't been able to figure it out yet. It's been, I said it's been doing it for about 4 weeks or so now. Haven't been able to figure out what it is. It also comes and goes, so it's hard to always narrow it down because it doesn't always do it. So I don't know. I'm gonna say it's a demon.
A demon.
We got demons.
So there's a demon in the sanctuary.
I was going to say something funny to you about the way our Bible is set up. It makes it easier to sing the song.
That's how it's.
Sings the books of the Bible.
You know, if you ever wanted to get like I have a Jewish study Bible. If you ever want to get Amazon, just search Jewish study Bible, and it's like our study Bibles. You know, you get an NIV or an ESV or whatever it is, study Bible, right? And you've got notes, you know, someone's helpful information. Well, the Jewish study Bible is just notes by rabbis. So it helps Jews interpret things differently than Christians do, and so sometimes it's helpful to get back to maybe even the way that Jews originally would have interpreted things, because we interpret things in light of Jesus, which is fine, right? But Jews don't, right? Because Jews don't have Jesus, and so they interpret things differently, and so sometimes it helps us get back to the first place you want to interpret something is try to get back to the original meaning, which didn't include Jesus, right? Because the Old Testament, what we have to understand is that Jesus may fulfill things that Old Testament authors talked about, but Old Testament authors were not talking about Jesus. And when the Old Testament authors are talking about a Messiah, they're also thinking of something very differently than the kind of Messiah that Jesus was, which is why Jesus confused so many people. So the place to try to always start is back to the original, which can be difficult because we know the end to the story, right? So sometimes it's like, you know, if you watch a movie or read a book for, you know, the 5th, 6th, 7th time and you know the ending, things don't surprise you the same, right? You watch it differently because you know the way that it's going to end. And so the same thing I think is true with the Old Testament, is that since we know the ending, sometimes we want to jump to Jesus a bit too quickly instead of letting ourselves get there. And a Jewish study Bible can help with that. But I say that to say, if you ever get a Jewish study Bible, the books are in a different order. So, you know, if you're going to look for like the book of Ruth, like you would look for the book of Ruth in your Bible, you're not going to find it because it's not there. It's with wisdom literature. And so it's going to be in a little bit of a different order.
The Jews are still looking for the Messiah to come.
Some are. You've got Messianic Jews that still await a Messiah. You have other Jews that don't believe that an actual Messiah is going to come, have given up hope. And then you have, so let me back up. So you've got Jews that are waiting the Messiah, you have Jews that aren't waiting the Messiah, and then you have Messianic Jews that believe that Jesus was the Messiah. So you do have some Jews that believe that Jesus was the Messiah. They just take a little different route in applying what that means than Christians would. It brings up an interesting conversation about where Messianic Jews fit into the overall scheme of things. But with that being said, I want to talk about the Gospel of Thomas. So, I know, I've tried to talk about the Gospel of Thomas for a month now. Okay, so when we're talking about other Gospels, the most important one is the Gospel of Thomas. We talked about how the Gospel of Thomas was discovered in 1945 as a part of the Nag Hammadi Library, which is in Egypt. We talked about why it was probably buried as Christians began to decide these are the books that are inspired, and we landed on 4 Gospels, the 4 canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that other Gospels would have been destroyed or buried or something like that. That's probably the case with the Gospel of Thomas. Now, here's the interesting thing with the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is dated anywhere from the year 60, so before the Gospel of Mark, to 250. So a couple of hundred years after our Gospels of the New Testament were written. Most scholars, and I would assent to this opinion, believe that the Gospel of Thomas was written in the 2nd century. So very soon after the writing of our Gospel. So let's remember, Mark was written in the 60s, Matthew was written in the 70s, Luke was written in the 80s, John was written in the 90s, and then possibly within 20 years the Gospel of Thomas was written. So it's very, very close to our Gospels of the New Testament. Like I say, a minority of scholars would say it predates the Gospels that we have. Most would say it postdates, but by a very short period of time, which is why it's so interesting. Because what you see in the Gospel of Thomas is you see some connections, some similarities with the Gospels of our New Testament. That is, it seems that at some points, the author of the Gospel of Thomas know the canonical Gospels. The author knows Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and is using them as sources to write his Gospel. His version of events, his version of the life of Jesus. But also what's interesting is that sometimes you have these similar stories, and the Gospel of Thomas is different than what we have in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And the reason that's interesting is if you remember, we talked about how the stories of Jesus were passed on first through oral tradition. Right? So Jesus lives and works and dies around the year 30. And the first gospel is written, the Gospel of Mark, about the year 68. So you're talking about maybe 40 years of difference between when Jesus dies and when the first record of his life is written. So we talked about where did the stories of Jesus, what were they doing during those 40 years? Well, they were being passed on orally through congregations, teaching and instructing future generations about Jesus.
When they found the scrolls in the cave, was there any part of those scrolls that referred to the Gospel of Thomas?
So you get some possible references to the Gospel of Thomas in places, which seems that it was at least somewhat widely known. And it seems that, so you have these similar stories in the Gospels of the New Testament and the Gospel of Thomas. When the Gospel of Thomas goes, it does something differently. The possibility is that the Gospel of Thomas is relying on oral tradition that is not in our New Testament Gospels. Which what it means is sometimes some of the things that the Gospel of Thomas says that's a little different than the Gospels of the New Testament may very well be accurate, may very well be historically true, because it relies on an oral tradition that the authors of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not have access to. Like, just think about that. You have these stories being passed on within communities, not every community has the same stories. So an author sits down to write, an author's reliant on the stories of the communities that he has access to, which means that there are communities that have stories that the author does not have access to, which means that the author of the Gospel of Thomas may have access to stories that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not have access to. There are also dissimilarities with the Gospels. There are sayings in the Gospel of Thomas that Jesus does not say in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that again may very well be what are called authentic sayings of Jesus, things that Jesus actually said, because of that idea that the author may be relying on oral tradition from communities that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did not have access to. And so I say it's the most important, not necessarily for your study, but in the grander scheme of things, it's important for scholars, because as scholars ask questions about the historical Jesus, what did Jesus historically do and say, they're not only focused on Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They want to bring in these other sources to ask these historical, that's what a good historian does. And so the Gospel of Thomas is very important in that, because it likely has some authentic things in it that we don't find in the New Testament. The other interesting thing about the Gospel of Thomas is it's a sayings gospel. There's no story. It's one saying after Jesus said, Jesus said, Jesus said, Jesus said, Jesus said. If you have one of the packets or you want to pick one up afterwards, I put some of the sayings on here, and that's what you'll notice. Jesus said, Jesus said, Jesus said, Jesus said, he said, Jesus said, Jesus said, Jesus said. There's no story, there's no context. We don't know where Jesus was when he says any of these things. It's just a list of sayings. That's another reason that the Gospel of Thomas is interesting, is because it's evidence that gospels such as this existed very early on, sayings gospels. And the reason that's interesting is there is what is called the synoptic problem. So the synoptic gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And they're called the synoptics because they're similar. Right? You read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they tell basically the same stories, basically in the same order. And then John gets all weird on us. Right? So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are similar. And what scholars believe, and there's very, very good evidence for this that I won't get into, but there's good evidence for this. Mark was written first. Matthew and Luke used Mark. That is, Mark was one of their sources. If you read the beginning of Luke, Luke says that he took great effort to compile all of this evidence. Like he went and did his research. Well, what was Luke reading? Who was Luke talking to? Well, I find it hard to believe that Luke wasn't reading the Gospel of Mark. That's been around for 20, 25, 30 years at this point in time. Luke's using the Gospel of Mark as one of his sources. And so you can see where Matthew and Luke use Mark. And so there are points in the Gospels where all three agree. Like all three are doing the exact same thing, telling the exact same story in the exact same way. There are other times that Matthew and Luke tell stories that Mark doesn't have. But what's interesting is the way Matthew and Luke tell them is they almost word for word agree. That like they were copying from somewhere, like they had the same source. Well, what was that source? Where was that source? What's interesting is where Matthew and Luke agree, and on stories that aren't in Mark, it's almost always sayings of Jesus. It's not stories. It's not narratives. It's Jesus said moments where Matthew and Luke agree and is not included in Mark, which has led scholars to postulate the existence of a source that is called Q, which would be a saying source. That when Matthew and Luke sat down to write their Gospels, they had all these sources. One of them was the Gospel of Mark, and one of them was a sayings gospel, just like the Gospel of Thomas. And that accounts for the agreement between Matthew and Luke. That's not included in Mark. And so the Gospel of Thomas gives us some insight into the fact that these kinds of gospels existed, that everything wasn't story form like we're used to in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but that some authors sat down and just recorded sayings of Jesus with no broader context.
Now, John was exiled in the Isle of Patmos.
Yes.
Is that where he wrote?
Probably not. John probably predates Patmos. That's more likely where Revelation was written, but the dates get a little bit fuzzy, so who knows? I would say the gospel, if we date the gospel as the first work of John, I would say it predates Patmos.
We need to have a 2-hour course.
Maybe not. Okay, so real quickly, I want to move on and I'm missing a slide, but that's fine. Okay, I want to read a couple of the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas and show you some of the similarities with the Gospels. I'm going to read some of these and I want you to think, have you heard this before? So saying 34 in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus said, if someone who's blind leads someone else who's blind, both of them fall into a pit. Y'all heard that before? Jesus says that in Matthew 15 and verse 14. We have the exact same thing in the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas saying 44, Jesus said, whoever blasphemes the Father will be forgiven, and whoever blasphemes the Son will be forgiven. But whoever blasphemes the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven, either on earth nor in heaven. Heard that? That's one of those that shows up in multiple of our Gospels. The blaspheming of the Holy Spirit being a sin that will not be forgiven. The Gospel of Thomas saying 48, if two make peace with each other in a single house, they'll say to the mountain, go away, and it will. What's interesting there is we have Jesus talking about being able to say to a mountain, move, and it moves. But you'll notice that it's in a different context in the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas, we have Jesus saying, anyone who makes peace with, in essence, their brother or sister, then they will be able to move mountains. In the Gospels, Jesus says, whoever has faith as small as a mustard seed will be able to say to a mountain, move, and it will move. So you have the same saying of Jesus, a little bit of a different context, which you can think about scholars who are studying history, how interesting that would be, like comparing these very similar sayings, but you have these little bit of differences, and asking, how does that factor into a historical reconstruction of Jesus?
Well, also, and have the faith to be able to move mountains, but have not love, you understand, and then making peace be in that love. I saw a comparison immediately.
It fits, right? Which is one of the things that you could say, maybe this is authentic.
Right.
I could see Jesus saying this, and it fits with what we have in the Gospels. Maybe the Gospel of Thomas includes something that is historically accurate. Now, here's something that's interesting to think about, and we're going to discuss this a little later, but there's debates about whether or not the canon is open. And by that I mean, for example, we know that Paul wrote letters that we don't have anymore. So we know, for example, that Paul wrote a letter to Laodicea, which could have been the letter to the Ephesians, because it wasn't actually to the Ephesians, but that's something that we're going to talk about later as well. It could have been the letter that's addressed to the church in Ephesus, because originally it wasn't addressed to a church. In Ephesus was added later. We'll talk about that later on, though. But let's just assume it's not. That's debatable. So we know Paul wrote a letter to Laodicea. We know that Paul wrote at least maybe one more letter to Corinth. And so people debate, what if tomorrow someone stumbles into a cave in the Middle East and finds Paul's letter to Laodicea? Do we add it to the Bible, or do we leave it out of the Bible? We know it's authentic. We know it's written by an apostle. We know it was important for the church in Laodicea. Do we add it to the Bible? We're going to talk about that here in a couple weeks. But I'll go ahead and tip my hat for where I stand. So an open canon would mean if we find something, we can still add it to the Bible. A closed canon is, it doesn't matter what we find, we're not going to add it. I believe the canon's closed. And my argument for that is, remember we talked about a book being inspired is something that has been life-giving for most Christians for most time. Like that's what they were thinking when they came to the 66 books of our Bible. They were asking those kinds of questions. Well, if we find a book that's been in a cave for 2,000 years, it's not a book that has been life-giving for most Christians for most time. So I would argue it's not inspired. It's interesting. It's helpful. It would help us to reconstruct the status of early Christianity, right? But it is not something that we would put on the same level as what we believe to be inspired, which is what we have in our Bibles, if that makes sense. So we look at something like the Gospel of Thomas, which can be very interesting because we have something here that may be something that Jesus authentically said. But even if we can say that it's authentic to Jesus, it's kind of interesting. We believe that Jesus is the Son of God, and we believe that something to be authentic, but at the same time, we don't put it as authoritative as the words of Jesus that we have in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right?
Something like that would fill in the gaps of history.
Yes, it feels I think that's a good way to put it. You can think of these kinds of things as they fill in the gaps of history, but they don't fill in the gaps of theology, right? They become historical documents. They do not become theological documents. They speak to the historian in our effort to know Jesus historically. They don't speak to the church in our effort to know Jesus is the Son of God, right? So there's a distinction there. But it's still interesting for us that are interested in Jesus, I think. So this is one of the most interesting ones to me. Saying 65, he said, a creditor owned a vineyard. He leased it out to some sharecroppers to work it so he could collect its fruit. He sent his servant so that the sharecroppers could give him the fruit of the vineyard. They seized his servant, beat him, and nearly killed him. The servant went back and told his master. His master said, maybe he just didn't know him. He sent another servant, but the tenants beat that one too. Then the servant sent his son, thinking maybe they'll show some respect to my son. Because they knew that he was the heir of the vineyard, the sharecroppers seized and killed him. Anyone who has ears to hear should hear. That's the parable of the wicked tenants. It shows up in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the Gospel of Thomas. And so, with the Gospel of Thomas, you have some similarities with the Gospels. You have some slight differences, but in those stories we saw nothing major. And so there are some points that are helpful, I think, for history, as we talked about, our historical understanding of Jesus. But there are other texts that show us why this gospel was rejected. There are points of this gospel that seem to be Gnostic or proto-Gnostic. So Gnosticism was a false teaching that arose in the 2nd century with roots in the 1st century. And by roots, I mean it's now believed that there were no Gnostics in the 1st century. Some used to think that the letters of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John were combating Gnosticism. in John's community. It's now believed that these might have been the early roots of what later becomes a Gnostic movement, but that the movement didn't really begin until the 2nd century. Gnosticism believed a couple of things. Gnosticism was in essence a return of Platonism and the philosophy of Plato. So Gnosticism believed that there was this hidden knowledge that only the elect were able to tap into. It also believed that the physical world was evil and bad. So physicality was bad. Our bodies are bad. The physical world is bad. All of this is bad. And naturally, if you believe that the physical world is bad, that leads to a couple of conclusions you have to come to. So if our bodies are bad and evil, then it doesn't matter what you do with your body. So sexual immorality was rampant among Gnostic communities because they believed our body is bad. God doesn't care about the body. God didn't create the body because it's bad. God can't create anything that's bad. God's going to destroy the body because it's bad, so use your body however you want. Right? As long as my mind believes in God, it doesn't matter what my body does. Also, if it's all bad, then God didn't create it. So you had this theory of you had one ultimate God who created other beings, and these other beings created other beings, and those other beings created other beings, and then those beings that are, like 10 times removed from God, then created the physical world, which is evil and bad. Right? So God didn't create it because it's bad. These beings that are very far removed from God created it. So that's a brief introduction to Gnosticism. And we see that in a couple of places, and this is how we'll end. I want to read these two. Saying 3, Jesus said, if your leaders tell you, look, the kingdom is in heaven, then the birds of heaven will precede you. If they tell you it's in the sea, then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is within you and outside of you. When you know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will realize that you are the children of the living Father. But if you don't know yourselves, then you live in poverty, and you are the poverty. You see a movement of the kingdom of God away from anything physical and a move to, it's just inside of you, right? You reject everything else. It's inside of you, and you have to find it, right? You have to find this hidden knowledge that's inside of you, and then you will find God. Very different than what we see in the New Testament. Saying 29, Jesus said, if the flesh came into existence because of spirit, that's amazing. If spirit came into existence because of the body, that's really amazing. But I'm amazed at how such great wealth has been placed in this poverty. The poverty he's talking about is our bodies. It's, as Jesus saying, I'm amazed at how great a wealth, in essence, our soul is that's inhabiting this horrible body that we have. Which again is very different than what we see in the New Testament, right? The New Testament hinges on the hope of resurrection. That Jesus will be, that Jesus was resurrected, and in turn those who follow Jesus will be resurrected. So it's not a complete rejection of the body. And so that shows, we talked a little bit about how the Gospel of Thomas may be helpful for us historically, right? There are sayings that might be authentic. Other ones that I have in there, saying 98 and 82 at the end of the section are sayings that are probably authentic as well. So helpful in understanding maybe some historical reconstruction of the first century. But it's also Gnostic. So you have the rejection of the body, the rejection of the physical world, rejection of the resurrection, rejection of God being the ultimate creator, and so on and so forth. So, like we've tried to do, we see how some of these may be helpful for us, and at the same time, being able to see how they may also, why also they were not included in the New Testament, right? It kind of gets a little bit squirrely at some Okay, so next week we've got just a few more weeks until the end of the year. The last Sunday of the year, I will not be here. So next week we'll quickly talk a little bit about the Gospel of Peter, a little bit about the infancy Gospel of Thomas, so a different Gospel of Thomas. And then we'll move on to some other discussions that will move us towards the end of the year. That's all I have.
Who was it? It said that God must have loved the common man because he makes many apples.
That's true. Grab a copy of this if you don't have one.
It's
The New Testament. This is the only New Testament one. Let me know if we need more copies. I didn't check this morning.
no, I didn't get the New Testament.
But I can make some more for next week. So there's 2 Old Testament ones,
Yeah.
and then there's 1 New Testament.